So I like the start of Cuto with that stalking scene so much that I didn't want to kind of explain what I'm doing on these books. Now, those of you who've read my books understand it, and I've done some of this with the school right here in Story. But what I'm doing is telling the books in the series of the Medallion, um, going through them, but only going through half of them. Those of you who've read them know there's a whole simultaneous adventure going on in modern times with Juan and Sophia, 13-year-old uh, identical twins who come into possession of the medallion about 1995. Um, so there's the ancient adventures, which is what I'm telling. And in the books, there's also parallel modern adventures with the medallion through each book. The other thing I wanted to be clear about, which is Cuto takes place about 80 years after Adzul. So Adzul, at the time he turns over the medallion, is between 80 and 90 years old, and he's still, um, going strong and hunting and everything. And part of the modern side of the story is that Juan and Sophia are being told have been just given the medallion by their great grandfather, and he is 100. So what we have going on with this series is the medallion appears to give long life to the wearer. Okay, so that I just wanted to fill those of you who don't know anything about this in a little bit about what's going on here. Your page, the page you look at with my stories, should show the books across the top of the page. It's a 5-book series: Adzul, Cuto, Lita, Tucor, and Ricardo. And then there's another book shown there which is unrelated to those, a different book called Sold into Shackles. But you should see those books across the top of the page. So what I thought it would be fun to do is, it's called serializing, is tell an episode, roughly, I'm trying to make them roughly 30 minutes long, um, out of the book and progress through the ancestor adventures with the medallion. So that's what this is all about. For those of you who don't know anything, you know, about this series, hopefully that's an explanation to get you up to speed. I probably should have done it at the beginning of episode 1, but I really like that stalking scene where Cuto, 20 years old, is trying to sneak up on Adzul. He's been trying his whole life, and he doesn't. Adzul only let him do it once when he was 5 years old. He's been trying his whole life, never pulled it off. So anyway, so that's what this is all about. And let's go forward with episode 2. The medallion started to get warm, and Cuto said, we got to stop. I think there may be danger. And the medallion got a little bit more than warm on his chest. So they stopped just before they crossed the top of the hill. And this thin line of smoke was going up into the sky. And Adzul said to his 5 friends, "Get out your atlatls and your spears and hold them at your sides as though they were walking sticks. Rhea and I will get the slings out." And before we do that, he said, "Rhea, let's get the armor shirts out also. Put on our armor shirts under our cotton shirts," which they did. And then they loaded their slings and just let them dangle almost to the ground by their right hands. He also told Tenoch, tie the donkey's tail to head, so that only one person needs to lead the donkeys, and everybody else is free. And when we get close, if whatever the danger is here, we get close, we can let the donkeys loose, and they're just going to be all tied together. They'll stay in the area. So they got all that done and crossed over the top of the hill, and they were entering a small desert valley. And about 200 yards ahead of them, they could see a campfire. And even at that distance, they could see there were figures around the campfire. So they went down the hill onto the flat of this little gentle valley rising to either side, not a big valley, and started walking closer. And as they got closer, they began to discern that there were 8 men around the campfire. And some of them had bits of armor on, a piece of armor here and a piece of armor there. All of them had swords at their belts, and there were a few lances leaned up against a rock to the side of the fire. As they got even closer, they saw that the men were extremely dirty. They faces, hands, arms, legs, they were just extreme. Their hair was extremely dirty. And they didn't have any provisions. They had nothing. And Tenoch, in a soft voice, said, "I've heard about these kind of men." He said, "See, they're white-skinned. I've heard about men like these that desert the conquistador armies and go out into the countryside, and they'll kill and pillage anybody they come across. They're very dangerous." And Cuto, they never broke stride. They kept walking slowly forward. Cuto said, "Well, when we get close, what I want you guys to do, leave Rhea and me in the middle, and you guys spread out to either side of us. And I want you to pick, if these men attack, I want you to each pick one. There's 7 of us and 8 of them, and use your spears with the atlatls. If they have armor on their upper body, do not throw at their upper body. Throw at the legs or lower body where there's no armor." And now all these 5 guys with Cuto were all farmers, but they had trained since they were children with the atlatl and spears, and they were capable of hitting a rabbit dead on at 30 yards with their spears. So while they were farmers, they were also really skilled with the atlatls and spears. So they slowly approached, and they got to within about 50 yards of the campfire, and kind of spread out in a line, and Tenoch let the donkeys go. And while they had been approaching, the conquistadors had been talking among themselves also. And the leader of the conquistador renegades was saying, "Well, they've got 4 donkeys. They got a lot of provisions." He said, "We're going to feast tonight. We'll kill every man. Don't kill the woman. We'll have a big feast tonight." and these guys are just vermin. We'll destroy them. So, but he turned to the Aztecs and gave a big smile and waved, a big friendly smile. And about 40 or 50 yards away, Cuto stopped his group, and they just casually spread out to either side of him and Rhea and just stood there. And when the leader smiled and waved at Cuto, Cuto smiled and waved back. And the leader called out in Spanish, which the Aztecs didn't speak, called out in Spanish, come on over to the fire. And Cuto and his guys noticed that every one of the renegades had a hand on their sword, and a couple of them were edging toward the lances stacked against the boulder. Rhea's face was calm, but inside she was panic-stricken. The men looked so big and so fierce, she was scared to death, and her hand holding the sling started to shake. And Cuto, out of the corner of his eye, saw that, and he in a very, very low voice, he said to her, "Now, I'm going to take the leader, and you take whoever comes next to the leader." Now, this is really going to be easy, because you'll notice they all have big noses. So just aim for his nose, and everything's going to be fine. You can hit the ear of a desert sheep at 30 or 40 yards with your rock. You've done it time and time again. This nose is a much bigger target. And he broke the tension. And Rhea almost giggled. He broke the tension, and all of a sudden she went totally calm. And her eyes blazed, because she realized these guys meant to kill her husband, and she wouldn't, her new husband, brand new husband, and she wasn't going to allow that to happen for nothing. So the leader, the renegade leader, waved and kind of motioned them, come on over to the fire. They all stood in their line, and Cuto called out, which the Spanish couldn't understand. In Aztec, he said, "Well, we're ready whenever you are," with a big smile on his face. And the leader motioned once more for them to come, and none of them moved. And the leader lost it. And he screamed, "Get them!" And all 8 of the conquistadors charged simultaneously with their swords out. Tenoch was the fastest with the atlatl. He of all of them, he was the fastest, and he loaded and threw his spear with his atlatl before any other spear was in the air, and then the others were right behind him, and the Cuto and Rhea started the slings, and the little whistle of the spears through the air was matched by the hum of the slings swinging through the air. Well, Tenoch's spear went right through a man, and the man screamed and went down. And in the first flurry, in the first flurry, 4, 2, 6, 7, 5 of the men went down. I was trying to keep the numbers right. I'm trying to remember from the book, keep the numbers right. 5 of the men went down. 2 kept coming. 3 kept coming. But reloaded spears from Patley and Matzel took them down. Cuto's rock had hit the forehead of the leader and broken his skull and, you know, killed him instantly. He was down, and Rhea's rocket hit smack on the nose of the guy beside the leader and smashed his nose, broken his cheekbone, um, blinded him with blood up in his eyes, and he fell and was sitting on the ground screaming in pain when a machete put him out of business. There was one conquistador left, and he turned and ran. And he ran for the hills. And Cuto sent Tenoch and Patley after him. And they took off. They grabbed extra spears and took off after the guy. When they were sure that all the renegades were completely dead, then Cuto and Rhea and the three others got the donkeys and went quite a ways away along the stream to a grove of trees and lay down. These guys were farmers. They weren't warriors. They weren't used to fighting. They had been cool as cucumbers, but the tension of the situation had been so great that they were completely a wreck, and Rhea was in tears. And Cuto held onto her and stroked her head and told her how proud he was of her and how brave she'd been and so on. And gradually, she started to calm down. The others sat with their arms on their knees, staring at the water of the little stream, just overcome with emotion. After a while, they kind of lay back, and the tension went out, and they all went to sleep. And when they woke up, Patley was back, and I can't remember. I think it's Matley or Tenoch went with him, and had come back. And they said, that guy could run. We're amazed. He ran for 2 miles. We finally trapped him. And he wasn't a coward. He charged. He turned and charged us. But we put him out of business and left his body there for the wolves and coyotes. Well, nobody was up to doing anything the rest of that day. They got the donkeys, and they just camped by the side of the stream and just chilled out and recovered from this battle. The next morning, they went back to the campfire, and the bodies of the renegades were so filthy, filled with lice and bugs and everything. Cuto made the decision not to try to bury them, to burn them, and make the area safe for any traders or anybody else who came up the trading path. So they went out in the desert and collected brush and made a huge pile of brush and put the bodies of the renegades all on the brush. They buried the armor. What armor there had been, they buried. But they took the swords and lance blades and broke them, intending to make spearheads or knives or whatever, because they were very, very sharp steel, to make useful weapons out of them or tools. And they threw all the bodies on top of this huge pile of brush and set it on fire, and this enormous black cloud of smoke went way up into the blue sky. While they were putting the bodies up on the brush, one of the men noticed that one of the conquistador renegades, his foot was turned out at 45 degrees from straight. So his foot was crooked. And they looked at it and they said, how could that guy keep up? He must have had an incredible limp. How could he have kept up with these guys walking through the desert. Um, he had a severe deformity. Anyway, as the smoke, as the fire was burning, Tenoch said, "You know what? If they'd had horses, we'd have been dead." And Cuto said, "You're right. Azul has told me for years how the conquistadors with a few horses against a superior force of men on foot could beat them every time. And they're very, very protective about their horses, but if they'd had horses, we'd all be dead now." So with that, they turned and headed um, on up the Trader's Path. And not long after that, one day, they were approaching a small river. And on the far side of the river, and the desert was pretty flat here, on the far side of the river was a body lying in the sand. And as they got closer and closer, all of a sudden Rhea started running forward, and she said, "I think that's a child." And she ran and ahead of them and splashed through the river and kneeled down by this body. And indeed, it was a child. And she turned the body over, because the body was face down, turned the body over, and it was a girl. And she had on a short, filthy leather shift just over her shoulders down to not even to her knees, covered with blood. Her face was covered with blood. Her feet were completely bloody and torn, and there was an enormous gash, an enormous wound on the left side of her head above her ear. The scalp had been, the scalp was hanging open and the skull was showing. And her face was filthy, covered with blood, and the others had caught up by now. Rhea said, "I think she's dead." And Cuto said, "She's been severely beaten. Her face was black and blue. One eye was closed, completely closed, bruised, closed." And he said, "Who would do this to a child?" And the other men, their eyes got really, really hard as they looked at this body. And Rhea leaned really, really close down, put her face really, really close down to the girl's mouth, and she could feel the faintest breath coming out of her mouth. And she said, "She's alive. She's alive." And picked her up and carried her across the river to a patch of grass under a few trees that were on the far side of the river where they had approached on the Trader's Trail, and laid her down in the grass. And she said, "We got to clean her up. Get me some cloth and wet it in the river." And she began to clean the girl's body. And she cut the shift was completely trashed, the leather shift. She cut that off the girl's body, and she started bathing her, cleaning her. And she cleaned her up, and as she was cleaning her up front and back, she said, "This girl has been whipped." And across the girl's back and legs were white scars all over her back and legs. And the men helping and looking at this, said, "Who would do this?" And Cuto said, "I think, as far as these recent wounds, I think that was done by a man. Um, I, I think he clubbed her and left her for dead. A woman would have run her through with a knife or something to make sure she was dead. This girl has survived because look at her feet. She has survived and come a long way after she was wounded." Well, Rhea asked them to get the sharpest needle they could out of the packs and some gut, which is what you make thread out of, gut from a pig or a sheep or something. They cut the gut into very, very thin pieces, and that's what the ancient people sewed things together with. And she bathed carefully the wound as best she could, and stitched the scalp back in place. And then she wrapped the girl's head completely in cloth, in a big bandage, wrapped her head in bandage. And the girl started to stir a little bit. And she told one of the men to get some water from the river. And the girl's good eye opened, and Rhea smiled, and her eye, when the girl's eye opened, it went wide with fear. And Rhea smiled at her and held a cup with a little water in it. And the girl took 2 sips and passed out. So Rhea got one of her shirts and put it on the girl, and it was as big as a dress on this girl. And they estimated she was 8 to 10 years old. So Rhea said, we gotta camp here and take care of her. And so they made camp. Rhea made a soft bed for her, and that night they the guys went out and got a desert sheep, killed a desert sheep, and they cooked some sheep, but they also made a very light broth stew and in a pot. And the girl woke up ever just for a little bit, and Rhea fed her a couple of spoonfuls of soup, and Rhea said, this girl's been starved. She is almost starved to death. She's so thin, and she doesn't weigh anything. Well, the days went by. Every time the girl woke up, Rhea was right there with her, smiling at her, and the men stayed away. The men stayed a distance, because whenever the good eye went to look at one of the men, she got scared. But gradually, Rhea kept feeding her, and she began to be able to eat a little bit more and a little bit more. Rhea didn't want to give her too much food for her stomach, because her stomach couldn't take it because she was starved. But gradually, she got better and better, and they stayed there a week. And by the end of the week, Rhea could talk with her with sign language. And Rhea found out this girl's name was Swallow, and she told the men this at night after the girl went to sleep. Her name was Swallow. She was a Pueblo Indian who'd been captured 2 years earlier by a raiding party of Comanche, and been enslaved and made the slave of an old woman in the Comanche camp, who tied her to the ground outside every night with nothing to cover her, regardless of the weather, made her sleep outside, and beat her whenever she didn't obey. But Swallow had a rebellious spirit, and she consequently suffered a lot of beatings, but also she never gave up. And one night she managed to steal a piece of bone out of the campfire. And a couple of days later, the old woman's son brought in some meat from a sheep or pig or whatever he killed and gave it to the woman. And that night, Swallow cut her leather strap tying her to the stake, grabbed the meat, and took off into the desert. She had no moccasins, no nothing. And she ran for 2 days. And she ate all the meat. And at the end of 2 days, her feet were really, really getting in bad shape because of the desert rocks. On the fourth day, the woman's son caught up with her. And she expected to be whipped and taken back to the Comanche camp. But the man said, my mother doesn't want you anymore. She told me to leave you out here in the desert. And with that, he clubbed her. He punched her in the face first, and then he clubbed her with a big rock on the side of the head as hard as he could. She had regained consciousness and started walking and falling and walking and falling and walking. And Matzel and Tenoch had backtracked her trail through the desert. They said she had walked for miles through the desert, and she told Rhea that she smelled water before she could see it. One eye was still completely shut, and by that time she was crawling, and she never made it to the water. And that's when they found her. So all this came out, and they spent a week there, and then decided it was time to move on. So they put Swallow on one of the donkeys, rearranged the donkey's loads, put Swallow on one of the donkeys, and took off. And they went upstream, followed the trader's path upstream along the river. End of the first day of going upriver, they found a grove of trees. The guys went out into the desert and killed a desert sheep for supper, and they had steaks and stuff from the sheep, and they made camp and staked the donkeys out and went to sleep. And every night, Swallow would sleep between Rhea and Cuto every night. And she felt really protected there. And she was still terrified, no matter what Rhea told her, she was still terrified the Comanche would come and get her. So they went to sleep. And it was just before light started in the eastern sky when Cuto came bolt upright awake. The medallion was hot on his chest. And that is the end of episode 2. Oh, sorry about that. Writing prompt. If you guys want to try, those of you who don't know this story, you want to do a writing exercise? Sorry about that. Forgot. So figure out what you think's going to happen next. Those of you who've read the books know, but those of you who haven't, do a writing description of what you think's going to happen next. All right, we'll find out tomorrow.